The granite in the Great Pyramid, if you look at the famous King's Chamber, its walls and its roof are, the ceiling of the King's Chamber are all made with gigantic granite blocks.
For 40 years, Graham Hancock pointed at the same piece of stone and asked the same question. Nobody in the academic establishment wanted to answer it. They wanted him to go away. They called him unqualified. They called him dangerous. They called his work a threat to public understanding of science and history. Then a material scientist with no prior stake in the debate pointed a scanning electron microscope at 4,000-year-old granite and found something that made the entire field stop. Not sand, not copper residue. A mineral rated 9 on the MO hardness scale. A mineral used today to cut the hardest engineering materials on Earth. It had been sitting inside those ancient cutting grooves since before Rome was founded. And Hancock had been right about the question the whole time. The problem in the stone. Ancient Egypt built with two materials. Limestone for the bulk. Granite for what mattered most. The outer casing of the Great Pyramid, the internal passages and chambers, the obelisks that carried royal proclamations, the sarcophagi that held the most sacred remains, the innermost sanctuaries of the most important temples, wherever the ancient Egyptians wanted to make something permanent, something sacred, something that would outlast every civilization that came after them. They used granite, specifically the red and gray granite quarried at Aswan, nearly 900 kilometers south of Giza, then transported by the Nile to the building sites of the north. Inside the Great Pyramid, the King's Chamber is built entirely from Aswan granite. The 5 courses of granite beams forming the relieving chambers above it, each slab weighing between 25 and 70 tons, were cut and fitted with tolerances that engineers who have measured them describe as extraordinary. The sarcophagus in the King's Chamber is a single hollowed block of red granite too large to fit through the current entrance to the pyramid, which means it was placed inside the chamber before the chamber was sealed around it. But the Great Pyramid is not the most extreme example of what ancient Egyptian granite workers achieved. That title belongs to the Serapeum at Saqqara. Carved into the bedrock beneath the desert south of Cairo, the Serapeum contains a series of burial chambers for sacred apis bulls. Inside those chambers sit granite sarcophagi, large boxes of red and black granite, each weighing between 70 and 80 tons cut from single blocks of stone. Their lids, each weighing roughly 27 tons, fit so precisely against the box rim that when sealed, they create a near airtight contact that engineers who have examined them describe as requiring tolerances measured in hundredths of a millimeter across a contact surface several meters long. The exterior surfaces of the boxes bear none of the rough tool marks that conventional abrasive and copper methods produce. They are polished to a mirror finish that reflects light across the chamber walls. No modern research team has attempted to explain how that finish was achieved with the tools the textbook credits. The conventional account has no explanation to offer. It simply does not discuss it. Flinders Petrie, the founder of modern scientific archaeology in Egypt, was among the first to examine the granite work systematically. In the 1880s, he documented something he found deeply puzzling. Hollow cylindrical cores pulled from Aswan granite bearing spiral grooves on their outer surfaces. Petrie analyzed the pitch of those grooves carefully and concluded that whatever had drilled them was cutting through the granite at a feed rate of approximately 0.1 in per revolution, meaning that with each full rotation of the drill, the cutting surface was advancing 1/10th of an inch into solid granite. Petrie, who was not given to dramatic statements, called this rate of cutting extraordinary, stating in his published work that it indicated a cutting action far exceeding what modern practice had achieved with any known method. That was the 1880s. Petrie's observation sat in the archaeological literature for over a century. Most people who read it moved on without asking the logical follow-up question. One who did was Graham Hancock, the man who kept asking. Graham Hancock was born in Edinburgh, Scotland in 1950 and spent his early career as a journalist for The Economist and other major publications. He came to ancient history not through academia but through reporting, through the habit of asking sources to demonstrate their claims rather than accepting assertions at face value. What he found when he applied that habit to the accepted account of ancient Egyptian technology was a story that consistently failed to withstand demonstration. His 1995 book, Fingerprints of the Gods, which sold millions of copies in the years after its publication, made a central argument that the academic establishment found threatening precisely because it was specific, not vague speculation about lost civilizations, but targeted technical objections to the mainstream account of how particular things were built. The granite work at Giza, the precision machining evident in ancient artifacts, the features that engineers recognized as beyond the capabilities of the tools the textbooks credited. The response from professional Egyptology was not engagement. It was dismissal. Hancock lacked formal credentials. Therefore, his observations could be set aside. The logic was circular. The evidence doesn't matter because the observer is unqualified. The observer is unqualified because the credentialed community disagrees with the evidence. For 3 decades, that circularity held not because anyone demonstrated Hancock was wrong, but because the institutional machinery of academic respectability is very good at not looking at things it has decided not to see. In 2022, Netflix released Hancock's documentary series Ancient Apocalypse, bringing his arguments to an audience of tens of millions of viewers in weeks. The Society for American Archaeology responded with an open letter to Netflix criticizing the series, arguing it promoted pseudoscience and caused real harm to public understanding of the past. In 2024, Hancock debated Dr. Flint Dibble, an archaeologist from Cardiff University, in a widely watched exchange on the Joe Rogan Experience that attracted more than 10 million views. The debate was substantive, pointed, and revealing, not because one side won, but because it demonstrated that the technical objections Hancock had been raising for 30 years still had no satisfying conventional answers. The granite question specifically remained open. Hancock's challenge was straightforward. The official account says the ancient Egyptians cut granite using copper saws and sand as abrasive. Demonstrate it. Show me surfaces produced by copper and sand that match the ancient examples. No one had done it. No one had come close. Then someone decided to actually look at what was inside the ancient cuts, copper, sand, and the test that failed. Before addressing what the scanning electron microscope found, it is worth being precise about what it was expected to find, because that expectation reveals exactly what the mainstream account predicts and why the actual finding is so significant. Copper rates approximately 2.5 to 3 on the MO hardness scale, a measure of how resistant a mineral is to scratching. Granite contains quartz, feldspar, and mica. Quartz, granite's hardest component, rates 7 on the MO scale. The basic principle of abrasive cutting is that your cutting medium must be harder than the material you are cutting. Otherwise, the cutter wears away while the surface being cut remains intact. Copper at 2.5 to 3 cutting quartz at 7 is not a viable cutting system under any plausible combination of pressure and lubrication. Sand, which is primarily quartz and therefore also rated at 7, creates a temporary exception, but only if the sand particles are finer than the surface being cut and are maintained consistently between the copper tool and the granite. The moment the copper distorts, which it does rapidly under the required pressure, the sand particles embed in the soft metal and lose their effectiveness. Dennis Starks, an experimental archaeologist at the University of Manchester, spent years testing this. He built accurate replicas of the copper tube drills and flat copper saws that the mainstream account credits. He sourced appropriate sand. He applied what the evidence suggested about ancient technique as faithfully as he could. His published results showed that copper tube drills with quartz sand could drill granite, but at a rate of advancement measured in millimeters per hour with rapid copper degradation that required continuous tool replacement. The surfaces produced were rough, inconsistent, and bore no resemblance to the clean, continuous spiral grooves that Petrie had documented. What is significant is that Petrie himself did not fully believe in the copper and sand explanation. In his original published analysis of the drill cores, he suggested that the cutting efficiency implied by those spiral grooves could only be accounted for by a tool fitted with fixed cutting points of a material harder than quartz. He specifically mentioned corundum and jewels as candidates. Petrie wrote this in the 1880s. The academic mainstream subsequently chose the copper and sand framework, and Petrie's own stated reservations were quietly set to one side, where they sat for over a century until Dr. Massoud's microscope went looking for what the stone actually contained. Chris Dunn, a precision machining professional with 4 decades of experience working with CNC equipment and aerospace tolerances, examined ancient Egyptian granite artifacts firsthand and published his conclusions. He found surfaces flat to within thousandths of an inch across meters. He found drill holes maintaining perfect circularity throughout their full depth. He described these results as matching or exceeding the standards achievable with modern precision manufacturing equipment. Not approximately matching, matching precisely. When 2 independent approaches, experimental archaeology and professional engineering assessment, both fail to support the copper and sand explanation, the honest intellectual response is to ask what the stone itself says about how it was worked. That is exactly what Dr. Massoudi decided to do, what the microscope found. Dr. Massoudi is a specialist in tribology, the science of friction, wear, and the interaction of surfaces under pressure and motion. It is one of the most precise disciplines in material science, concerned with understanding at a molecular level what happens when one material moves against another. His expertise had nothing to do with ancient Egypt before this investigation. That independence was for the purposes of the research essential. The tools Dr. Massoudi and Hancock used were scanning electron microscopy, which images surfaces at magnifications thousands of times greater than optical microscopes, and energy dispersive X-ray spectroscopy, which identifies the chemical elements present in a sample by analyzing the X-rays it emits under electron bombardment. Together, these instruments do not simply show what a surface looks like. They show what it is made of at the level of individual elements and compounds. They examined ancient Egyptian granite cutting surfaces, the interiors of tool grooves made 4,000 years ago and left undisturbed since. They show what it is made of at the level of individual elements and compounds. They examined ancient Egyptian granite cutting surfaces, the interiors of tool grooves made 4,000 years ago and left undisturbed since. What energy dispersive spectroscopy returned was something else entirely. Corundum aluminum oxide Al2O3, the mineral that forms rubies and sapphires in its crystalline state. Rated 9 on the MO hardness scale. Harder than quartz. Harder than any component of granite. Second only to diamond. The same mineral that industrial abrasive manufacturers synthesize today specifically because nothing else cuts engineering hard materials as effectively. This was not a trace contamination. The corundum particles were embedded within the cutting grooves themselves in positions and concentrations consistent with having been actively present during the cutting process. They were not deposited afterward. They were there when the granite was cut. The microscopy revealed additional details that compounded the significance of the corundum finding. When a surface is worked by hammering or by an abrasive moving erratically under inconsistent pressure, the stone beneath the visible cut shows subsurface fracturing. Micro cracks propagating downward and outward from the cut line into the body of the material. Sand abrasion under copper produces this signature reliably. The ancient cut surfaces showed something different. A clean shear boundary with almost no subsurface fracturing, suggesting that the force applied during cutting was consistent, directional, and controlled to a degree that prevented energy from scattering laterally into the surrounding stone. In tribological terms, this is the signature of a hard, well-laid abrasive moving in a controlled path under steady pressure, not the signature of sand embedded in soft copper being dragged irregularly across a hard surface. The significance of this finding turns on one geological fact. Corundum does not occur naturally in Egypt in any form suitable for use as an industrial abrasive. The nearest major natural deposits lie in regions including Sri Lanka, India, and the eastern Mediterranean areas that ancient Egypt maintained trade relationships with. But accessing corundum from those sources and recognizing its cutting properties would have required deliberate identification, long distanciance procurement, and systematic application. There is notably archaeological evidence that emery, a naturally occurring impure form of corundum, was traded in the ancient Mediterranean world. Deposits on the Greek island of Naxos supplied emery to craftsmen across the Iron and beyond from at least the Bronze Age onward. Egyptian craftsmen operating within one of the ancient world's most sophisticated trade networks had pathways to access corundum-bearing materials. What the microscope found was not an accident. It was evidence of a technology systematic, deliberate, and sophisticated that the official account had never described. The workshop test, a microscope finding, demonstrates what was present. It does not by itself demonstrate what was possible. Hancock understood this distinction, and he understood that his critics would reach for it immediately. So he tested it. In early 2023, Hancock organized controlled cutting trials in a working granite workshop. Blocks of granite, copper tools, 3 abrasive conditions tested separately and sequentially. Experienced granite craftsmen and material scientists working together under controlled conditions with everything measured and recorded. First, copper tools with ordinary sand as abrasive, replicating the conventional account as faithfully as possible. The result matched Stock's earlier experiments. 0.5 millimeter of progress per hour, rapid copper degradation, rough and irregular cut surfaces bearing no resemblance to the ancient examples. The textbook method produced textbook results in the worst sense. It did not work. Second, copper tools with ground quartz powder and slightly finer and more consistent than sand, but chemically identical, marginally better, still measured in fractions of a millimeter per hour, still rough. Third, copper tools with a slurry containing corundum mixed with quartz as a carrier medium. The change was immediate and striking. The copper stopped fighting the granite and began directing the abrasive efficiently across the cutting surface. Resistance dropped. The cut became smooth. Progress jumped to over 3 millimeters per hour, more than 6 times faster than the sand condition, and tool wear fell substantially. Nick Giza, a craftsman with 30 years of professional granite work behind him, was part of the trial. He had spent his career testing every plausible method for reproducing ancient granite surfaces and had consistently hit the same wall. Nothing he tried came close to what the ancient examples showed. When he set the copper tool into the groove with the corundum slurry and pushed, he later described the experience as the first time in 30 years that the material felt cooperative, like the tool and the stone were finally working with each other rather than against each other. Then came the drill cores. Corundum slurry loaded into a copper tube drill, pressed into granite, and rotated. The cores extracted from that process displayed the same distinctive spiral groove pattern that Petrie had documented in the 1880s and declared extraordinary. The grooves that no previous experimental method had ever reproduced. They appeared on the workshop table, cut fresh that afternoon, matching the profiles of artifacts that had sat in Cairo for over a century as examples of technique no one could explain. One afternoon, afternoon, one material, the answer to a mystery that had been open since the Victorian era. What the experiment also revealed was that the corundum method required real skill. The slurry concentration had to be maintained within a specific range. Too thin and cutting efficiency collapsed. Too thick and the groove clogged. Pressure had to be even, temperature managed, consistency sustained. In the workshop trials, the team found that the optimal corundum particle size was between 100 and 150 microns, fine enough to maintain consistent contact with the granite surface, but coarse enough to hold its cutting edge through multiple passes. Getting the mixture wrong by even a modest margin produced cuts that degraded toward the same roughness that sand abrasion leaves. Getting it right consistently across the hours or days required to hollow a sarcophagus or core a shaft required a level of trained muscle memory that only sustained practice produces. This was not a technology anyone stumbled across accidentally. It was a technology developed, refined, and transmitted through practice. The kind of knowledge that lives in hands, passed from craftsman to apprentice across generations, and that disappears completely when the chain breaks. The chain broke, the knowledge vanished, and for 4,000 years, the cuts it left behind sat in the stone, asking a question that everyone had agreed to answer incorrectly rather than look at carefully. Target is approximately 548 words. Here is the expanded version, the wall that wasn't about the evidence. When Hancock presented these findings, first at a materials science conference in late 2023, then publicly, the response divided along predictable lines. The engineers and material scientists in the room engaged with the data. Dr. James Harold, a geological archaeologist who had spent decades studying Egyptian quarrying methods, noted that abrasive slurries are inherently non-preserving. They work, they are used up, and they leave no residue that archaeological methods would detect as a deliberate tool. The corundum embedded in the cutting grooves might be the best physical evidence that will ever exist for this technology precisely because it survived inside the cuts while everything else was consumed by the process. Harold described the hypothesis as warranting serious scientific investigation and called for controlled replication trials under peer-reviewed conditions. The normal scientific response to an unexpected finding supported by physical evidence. Professional Egyptology responded differently, and the nature of that response revealed something important not about the evidence but about the institution. The objections were not technical. No Egyptologist demonstrated that copper and sand could produce the observed surfaces. No one provided experimental results matching the ancient examples by the conventional method. No one explained the corundum particles inside the cutting grooves. The objections were about Hancock's credentials and about the principle that outsiders should not be permitted to question settled conclusions regardless of what the physical evidence shows. The Society for American Archaeology's open letter to Netflix following Ancient Apocalypse argued that alternative archaeology caused harm to indigenous communities. A charge that, whatever its validity as a broader cultural critique, had nothing to do with whether corundum was present in ancient cutting grooves. Conflating the cultural politics of alternative archaeology with the specific technical question of what abrasive was used to drill granite is not a rebuttal. It is a change of subject. This pattern has precedent outside Egyptology. In the early 1980s, Australian physician Barry Marshall proposed that stomach ulcers were caused by bacterial infection, a finding that contradicted decades of established medical understanding. The medical establishment dismissed him for years. He eventually demonstrated the point by infecting himself with the bacteria, developing gastritis, and treating it with antibiotics. He received the Nobel Prize in Physiology or Medicine in 2005. The lesson the Marshall case teaches is not that outsiders are always right. It is that the credential of the observer is not a substitute for examining the evidence the observer presents. Hancock addressed this directly in a 2024 interview. He said the response confirmed what he had understood for 30 years. The resistance to examining this evidence had never been primarily about truth. It was about authority, about who controls the definition of the ancient past and who is allowed to contribute to revising it, about a system in which the price of admission is deference to existing conclusions, making genuine revision structurally impossible from within. The parallel situations are not hard to find. Across several other ancient sites where granite and hard stone work defies conventional explanation, the megalithic precisely fitted walls at Sakayan in Peru, the H-blocks and other precision stonework at Pumapunku in Bolivia, the colossal temple stones at Baalbek in Lebanon, where a single quarried stone called the Stone of the Pregnant Woman weighs approximately 1,650 tons, making it the largest quarried block in human history. The same pattern holds. Extraordinary physical evidence, conventional explanations that fail under testing, institutional resistance to examining the gap between the two. The ancient world's granite program operated across centuries, employed thousands of people, and moved stones of 100 tons or more across 900 kilometers of river. The scale suggests not a secret held by one craftsman, but a systematic endeavor industrial technology maintained across generations, documented not in surviving texts, but in the cuts left in the stone. Those cuts have been there the whole time. The electron microscope simply finally asked them what they were made of. What changes? Now the corundum finding does not explain everything about ancient Egyptian stone technology. It explains one specific thing: what made certain cutting processes work at a precision that copper and sand cannot achieve. How the corundum was sourced, processed, and distributed at industrial scale remains an open question. Whether similar findings will emerge from systematic examination of stone surfaces at other ancient sites is something no one has yet tested comprehensively. What the finding does with considerable force is close one specific argument: the argument that there is no evidence of a technology beyond copper and sand. There is now evidence. It is sitting in the ancient cutting grooves. The electron microscope found it. What it opens is the much larger question Hancock has been pointing at since 1995. If the conventional account was wrong about this, if the answer to one of the most specific and testable challenges to mainstream Egyptology turns out to be confirmed by material science, what else in the accepted account deserves the same careful physical examination? The ancient granite drill cores that Petrie documented in the 1880s are still in the Cairo Museum. The surfaces are still there to scan. The analytical instruments now exist that did not exist in Petrie's time. The question of what made those grooves can now be tested rather than assumed. And the Serapeum boxes at Sakura, those 70 to 80-ton granite enclosures with their near airtight lids and mirror-polished surfaces, have never been analyzed with energy-dispersive X-ray spectroscopy. No one has pointed a scanning electron microscope at their interior surfaces and asked what abrasive left its signature in the polish. The answer to that question is sitting in the stone, preserved in the same way the corundum was preserved in the cutting grooves at Giza, waiting as Petrie's drill cores waited for someone to look with the right instrument. If the same corundum signature appears in those surfaces, if the mirror finish on a 70-ton box turns out to have been produced by the same technology that cut the drill cores, the implications for our understanding of ancient Egyptian industrial capability reach well beyond any single site or any single debate about credentialed observers. Graham Hancock spent 40 years being told he was not qualified to ask the question. The corundum particles in 4,000-year-old granite did not care about his qualifications. The stone held the answer. Someone finally looked. If this is the kind of investigation that keeps you awake, subscribe now, because the next surface being scanned belongs to a site that makes this one look straightforward. And I want you here when those results come back.